it's a very big topic, as Ruth said, and there are many causes. Africa is a very large continent. Actually, it's much larger than most of us realize. And there's a lot of diversity there. So trying to address all this in 15 minutes is a big challenge, but there are many speakers, so I trust that unless everybody's going to say the same things, then I'm very lucky to be first. But I trust that the explanations will be a bit different and that we will complement each other. So my explanation is one relating to history. I'll say something about the very long run of history and institutions and policy. First of all, is this the right question? Why is Africa still poor? An alternative question could be, why is so much of the world rich? Because if you take the very long run of history, it's actually a very special thing in the history of humanity that so large share of humanity is actually living such a plentiful life in material terms. Africa is actually, by looking at the long run of history, actually people in Africa have a much higher say, level of material welfare than people have had for most of the existence of mankind. So, and there was a turning point at around 1800. Up to that point, more or less everybody in the world was living at a, say, existence minimum. So something happened there. So, why is Africa still poor? Well, first answer is that there has been less economic growth in Africa than in other parts of the world since 1800. And I would say especially the last 50 years. If you go back to about 1950, mean and per capita income in Africa was much the same as in Asia. But Asia has had faster growth. And this relates both in total income, if you take the whole income for the country, and even more in per capita terms, because Africa has had higher rates of population growth than in many other continents. But, as Ruth said, over the last decade, growth rates have been very high in many African countries, higher than in other parts, so you can say in one sense they are catching up. And we should also mention that money isn't everything. I mean, that's what per capita income talks about. If you look at developments in health and education, there has been huge improvements in very many African countries. Much more than, say, what their level of income should allow for, in a way. So in that sense, there have been big improvements in living standards, but I'll talk mostly about incomes. So why less growth? Well, economists have done lots of so-called growth regressions, where they try to take data sets of countries in the world and see if they can find correlation between the growth levels or growth rates and other characteristics of the countries. And basically, there is just a couple of robust findings coming out of that, robust correlations. And that is that higher growth is correlated with higher saving and investment level, which in a way begs the question, well, why is investment higher, or why isn't investment and saving higher in Africa? Or in other poor countries, and one explanation could actually be that the correlation or the causation runs the other way. High income allows for higher saving and investment, and that's actually what an economist called Danny Roderick has found. So it doesn't really answer the question. And also another thing that we find in these regression studies is that it's good not to be a sub-Saharan African country. Sub-Saharan African countries do worse than other countries, everything else being equal. So what is it with Africa? And among development economists, the current debate runs in terms of big explanations. Is it geographic destiny, or is it institutions, which is the other kind of main explanation? And as I said from start out, I tend towards the institutional explanation. But let's first say something about geography. In these correlation studies, you find that tropical countries are poorer than other countries. It's bad to be located along the equator. And of course, much of Africa is along the equator. And why could that be? It could be because of temperature, as already Montesquieu said some 100 years back. I mean, if it's very hot, it's hard to work, do heavy work, and so on. It could be soils. Africa is a very old continent where there is a lot of rain. The soils are degraded, poor in nutrients, and so on. And where there isn't much rain, well, then of course it's hard to grow crops. It could be, of course, there are lots of tropical diseases, which are bad in many ways also for how productive people can be. And these things together have given Africa low population density. And this is bad in the sense that it means that infrastructure costs are high. It's expensive, at least in per capita terms, to build roads and railways and so on, to have trade with the rest of the world. And especially because Africa is extremely landlocked. There are studies showing how big share of the population is living remote from the oceans or from, say, waterways where you can transport things. And Africa has a very high share of its population living far from let's say, international trade routes, ocean-based trade. There are no, well, except for the Nile, I guess, very few rivers going into the continent as you can find on other continents. So trade is expensive. But you could say one exception here, an interesting exception to the, say, bad history of Africa is Botswana. It's been for many decades been one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Well, it's not in the tropics, but it has very little rainfall, it's low population density, the soils aren't particularly good, high infrastructure costs, and it's definitely landlocked. Of course, you could say that it's got diamonds, but still, I mean, there are other countries that have natural resources and haven't really been able to benefit from them. So it points to something else, and I think Botswana points to this institution story. So institutions and policy. This, by the way, is a map of Africa that was drawn in 1860. I think it's dated to 1860 when this institution here was established, a few years later. And you'll see that much of the interior of that continent is described as unknown territory. And actually it was around 1860 that the first European explorer found the source of the Nile. So that says something about how distant Africa has been from the rest of the world. I mean, the Africans knew that the source of the Nile was there, obviously, although they didn't know that river by the name of the Nile. Those who lived in Uganda at that time. Okay, so one story which I'd like to mention is Jared Diamond's story. I don't know if you read his book, Guns, Germs and Steel. It's a fascinating book, which I recommend. But his story is that Africa was special in terms of, well, it's actually geography, that it had very few plants or animals that could be domesticated, that were suitable for that. So, which meant that it was hard to establish settled agriculture. Agriculture did not develop in Africa, well, except for in the Nile, in Egypt. So, when I talk about Africa, I should mention I'm primarily talking about sub-Saharan Africa here, which I think all the speakers are probably likely to do. So, And when you don't have agriculture, you don't develop hierarchical settled farmer societies that can be, farmers can be taxed, and based on that taxation you can develop a, say, institutions, organizations, alphabets, written culture, and so on. Most Africans were hunter-gatherers, and this was not a bad mode of living, by the way, as Marshall Salins, the anthropologist, he called it the original affluent society. But it meant that Africa was an easy victim for European colonizers. So we had a scramble for Africa from, well, during the 19th century, certainly. We had the slave trade, I'm sure somebody is going to talk about that. And we had division of Africa by the colonial powers. So this is a map of Africa from 1940, I think, where you have the countries are colored by one color for each of the colonizing powers. And these colonizing powers drew the borders between the countries of Africa. The African countries are, you could say, creations of the colonial powers. And they put in place extractive institutions designed primarily to extract as much wealth out of Africa as possible. So they had, for instance, little investment in education of the population in Africa, as opposed to, say, colonies in the temperate regions, such as Canada, Americas, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. And one legacy of this is that when African countries became independent, they were young, weak, fractionalized states with little basis in pre-colonial divisions. And there was a very weak notion of nationhood, of being in the same boat, as it were. And the language of the state is the colonizer's language in most countries. English in Kenya, and so on. And in policy terms, these weak and fractional states, in order to keep together, I mean, many of these African states, the central government has never really had control over its own territory. Look at Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, currently now, Zaire. The government never really has had control over its territory. So in order to keep together, it has put in place redistributive policies, which often are very not good for growth. It's had extractive institutions, autocratic regimes, and very weak checks and balances of the power of the president. And very often little rule of law, allowing the president to come up with, let's say, a good idea or to make big decisions, but which can often be very, can lead to bad results. And in many places, contested power and civil war. Another thing is that at the independence, in many of the countries, there was a division between the political power and control of the economy. The African population had control over the polity, but not over the economy. It was still in the control, of, say, of the colonial firms from the colonial power. East Africa, for instance, there had been a lot of immigration of Asians that ran much of, say, small business. And this made it very easy for this country, or very, say, attractive for the regime to adopt policies of naturalization, like President Mobutu in Congo nationalized all industry in 1972, gave it to the local population. And also to adopt the policy of import substituting industrialization. This to the disadvantage of much of local business, such as agriculture, for instance. Put in place trade barriers, overvalued exchange rates, parastatals and monopolies, things which have been a drag on the economy. And once again, Botswana is an exception, because there the polity, the ruling, elite after independence was also in control of much of the economy, especially the livestock sector, and therefore did not put in place such policies. The president was also an economist. Perhaps that could have had an influence. So, well, I have to be very quick here. I'll just conclude by saying that at current trends, I think there is reason for some optimism actually for Africa. Many African countries are experiencing a natural resource boom and getting income from that. I think there is a growing sense of nationhood in many African countries, but that takes a long time to develop. Norway has been a country for 1,000 years. Some of our sense of nationhood comes from there. We have one language and so on. And we see some trends towards more democracy. For instance, that in many countries there is a constitutional transfer of power. There are some checks on the power of the president. And they are instituting better policies for broad-based growth. For instance, by investing in education and in agriculture and rural sectors. And there is much more foreign direct investments, not least by the Chinese. And there are falling population growth rates, which makes it easier to achieve higher per capita income, and especially falling fertility rates, actually. So I think the African can catch up, but it will take some time. Still. Thank you.